Jarrett Gorin, to be followed by Alex Peugeot.
Good afternoon, Jarrett Gorin from Vanguard Planning.
Keep it fresh.
And my 13-year-old kid uses Uber.
Right on.
Everybody uses Uber. I am going to keep it fresh, but I am going to start off by saying something that I rarely ever say, if ever. I disagree with Danny Cato. You can have a statement at the back of your new zoning ordinance that says this doesn't address short-term vacation rentals. But if you're going and changing other definitions in that same ordinance, which do substantively affect them, you are doing something that affects them. And this new definition of residential use that was proposed in response to what we said at the last hearing, it's the same definition. They changed some words, but it says the exact same thing as before, maybe a little worse. I don't know why we're talking about hotels and extended stay hotels and things in a definition of residential use. Most definitions I'm familiar with in zoning ordinances talk about the thing you are defining. They don't list a bunch of things that you're not defining. And this is odd for that reason to begin with. But, you know, one has to wonder why it's there. Why are they doing this? And it's to restrict short-term vacation rentals. That is the goal of this. And as I discussed last week, this is never going to pass muster at the Coastal Commission. When Mr. Cato makes the statement that, well, this is consistent with the way the city regulates short-term vacation rentals, there really isn't a way the city regulates them because there's no regulations for them. They define them as hotels and then try to regulate them that way. And that's the purpose of this definition, is to further define them as hotels. As I discussed last week, that is in direct conflict with how the Coastal Commission defines them. And even though the city has told me point blank they don't care what the Coastal Commission thinks, I don't like the speed limit. I disagree with the speed limit, but you know, I better follow it because I'm not the ultimate arbiter of the speed limit. And when it comes to getting the local coastal plan updated, staff at the city is not the ultimate arbiter of who has to certify that. And so ultimately, if we adopt this definition, I think we're going to have serious problems later. On the language change in the conversion ordinance, Mr. Cato did talk about the fact that they've changed it to 2-unit and multi-housing unit, and he's correct that that does make it consistent, but the word he didn't address at all was rental. It currently says multiple family rental housing, and I would suggest that's a lot more than just an oversight in the purpose. If you read through the entire hotel conversion ordinance, there are paragraphs that speak to things that address tenancy and tenant displacement and first rights of refusal for tenants to purchase units. The findings in section 2888-120 F and G entirely relate to what happens if you're displacing rental tenants and wouldn't even apply to cases where it's not rental tenants. And I would offer that there's a reason why they have those findings that's consistent with the stated purpose in plain English of multiple family rental housing. So I offer, in contrast to Mr. Cato, that when you strike the word rental, you are expanding the scope, because something that previously only applies to rental housing that now applies to all housing, that is expanding the scope by any objective definition. And those were my comments.
So, Jared, on the definition, though, what your suggestion would be to eliminate the duration reference in the definition, and then also eliminate those things that are not residential, those words up there, hotel. So
that's what I'd recommend. I think it's very problematic to have a tenant or a length of tenancy component here. What happens if I own a second home in Santa Barbara and I temporarily abide there 1 week out of the month? Okay. Yeah, I own the house, but it's vacant the other times, and I'm there for 30 days or less. How does that work with this definition?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Alex Peugeot. Oh, any questions for Mr. Gorin? Go ahead, Mr. Schwartz.
Well, this may be for staff from what Mr. Gorin just said. So how would a scenario like that work that he just gave relative to the proposed language in the NZO?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, an owner of a property occupying the property does not do so under a license or a lease agreement or anything else. They do so under the rights of an owner. That's not a rental. So it would not impact, it wouldn't impact it's not a short-term rental. It's the occupancy by the owner. The fact that the owner chooses to have that property vacant the rest of the time, that's their election. That's like saying, if I go on vacation for 3 weeks this month, all of a sudden I've changed the use of my property that I have all the time. That's not the case.
But with all due respect, this doesn't say rented for less than 30 days. It says used as the abiding place for less than 30 consecutive days.
Commissioner Thompson.
Oh,
Yeah, I
I'm
was
sorry,
going
Mr.
to
Chair.
challenge
I'll come
Mr.
back.
Vincent. You talked about the owner's right, but the question that was raised is this definition doesn't talk about rental. It just says residential use, used as an abiding place for 30 consecutive days or less. So Mr. Gorin's example would say that this is not a residential use by this definition, right?
I agree. That's true. That we need to clarify.
So we need to get this cleared up.
We need to get this cleared up that the distinction is dealing with distinguishing rentals for less than 30 days or for 30 days or less.
I think, and I mentioned this last week, that we're trying to cover too many things with this paintbrush. Residential use means somebody's living in it. And we're trying to put fences around what that living in it means. And so the more we try to restrict it, the more difficult it's going to be to word it. But the way it's worded right now, Mr. Gorin's right. It covers an ownership property that's occupied less than 30 days a month. So we need to fix the wording.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Well, I'm still in a quandary about what the intent is here, Mr. Cotto, with this new language. It still seems fuzzy to me, and like I don't quite get the underlying intention with the exact language. 30 consecutive days, why are we talking about hotels and extended stay hotels? I don't really get the staff's objective here.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, the intention with this additional language is to clarify an ambiguity that the vacation rental folks are attempting to manipulate. The city's treatment between residential uses and transient uses that are deemed a commercial use, a hotel, is split by whether the occupancy, the rental occupancy, is of 30 days or less, or more than 30 days. That has always been the distinction between a residential use and a transient commercial use for the city. So staff has chosen to clarify that in the definition of residential use, explaining, yes, this is what a residential use is, and distinguishing what is not a residential use to clarify that ambiguity. That's why this language is being proposed, and I do agree with Commissioner Thompson that we need to clarify that it is a rental of the space for a period of 30 days or less, which is the transient use. That's consistent with the city's definition of transient use found in the transient occupancy tax, chapter 4.08, section 020, subsection G.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'll just quickly say, and I don't know if you're going to try to take this separately. On the one hand, I feel like we have conflicting pieces of information. On the one hand, I hear from staff, and we heard from Mr. Vincent last week, that the new zoning ordinance work effort will not be addressing or should not be addressing or should not incorporate anything regarding short-term rentals. However, now it looks like we're actually going there with this language. So I see a conflict. I see a tension and a conflict here. And, you know, I'm going to have to just mull this over as we continue on this evening. But there's there's a gap here for me. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Schwartz.